Hey everybody, welcome back to Pedaling Sunward. I'm Robert Hendry. We're going to interrupt our trip across the United States videos with a month-long trip that Carol and I and a friend of ours did where we went around Scotland. These next few episodes are going to be about that trip instead. So, why Scotland? About 300 years ago, give or take, the first Robert Hendry to come to America was kicked out of Scotland. He lived on the Isle of Arran, and he was a Jacobite, or at least accused of being a Jacobite. I wanted to see my ancestral homeland. Also, Scotland just has always looked so beautiful in the pictures. It's looks like it's got this wonderful climate, all these lovely hills, the heather, whiskey, like that a lot. So Carol and I have been talking about a bicycle tour in Scotland for years. So when I say biking around Scotland, we didn't hit everything in Scotland, but let me show you what our route looked like. So the plan was to fly into Edinburgh, take a couple of days looking around Edinburgh and assembling bicycles, and then from there we'd bike to Perth, on to Pitlochry, around to Avonmore, and then to Inverness, where we would tour Culloden. From there we would bike on to Embersham, and then around to Ullapool. In Ullapool we'd catch a ferry that took us out to the Outer Hebrides. We'd get into Stornoway, and we would bike up to the very top. Then we had a day off, which is good, because we then had to ride a long way all the way down the Isle of Harris, and then another long day all the way down the remaining islands of the Outer Hebrides. Then we'd catch a ferry that would take us back to mainland Scotland. We would bike from there to Kilmartin and on around to Tarbert. From Tarbert we would go down and catch another ferry that took us to Islay. Islay was our second day off period, so we would bike around there a bit, then catch a ferry back, stay overnight in Tarbert, then come back down, go over the peninsula, catch a little ferry that took us to Arran. And then from the ferry we would have a lumpy ride over to the Corrien. I planned a longer ride around Arran. And then the next day was a pretty tough day. We would bike back to the ferry, go over the peninsula, bike on up to Tarbert, and catch another ferry. This would be the last ferry that we would have on this trip, or so it was planned. That ferry would take us over to Portavadie. We would then bike from there over to Sandbank. From Sandbank we would bike up and take a look at Dunderave Castle, and then we would bike along the shores of Loch Lomond to Glasgow. We'd take a day off in Glasgow, and then finally bike into Edinburgh. From Edinburgh, Carol and I would catch the train down to London, and Jeff would fly back to Portugal. So you probably noticed throughout that description of our route, I had a lot of planned to's. As you'll see in the next few episodes, there are a few places where we had to make some adaptations. So let's talk about parameters. Parameters are important when you're planning a route. You want to know just how many miles you're really willing to go, how much climbing you're really willing to do, where you want to have breaks, either a day off or maybe a shorter day, maybe a period of a few shorter days. Ideally, you want those breaks to be somewhere where there's something to do, something to see, or maybe just nothing to do, but just take it easy because you're tired. So we did that throughout this trip. Let me show you a table and it'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So this is what I mean by interspersing some easy days and having some breaks in there. At the end of each of these tables, we had a day off. We've got a 35-mile day followed by a 50-mile day, preceded by a 56-mile day. Then we have a day off on the Outer Hebrides, and then we've got a long day, 52 miles, 41 miles, 69 miles, tough ones. We take a day off then on Islay at the end of this, Afterwards, not too bad, 23, 21 miles. That just warms us up for the day where we left Corey, 45 miles, 4,200 feet. Yeesh. So there's planning and there's preparation. You got to prepare your body. You got to prepare your bike. You got to make sure that you can pack everything that you need to have packed, that you might want to have out there. Not too much stuff. You don't want to have a bunch of junk that you're carrying for no good reason. But if there's something that you might need, you want to make sure that you've got it. So preparing the bike for us was getting it into a mechanic for a good going over. Replacing the chain, replacing the tires, making sure that everything was in top shape, making sure that we've got enough spare inner tubes, that we've got a spare tire, all of these things. A little thing full of nuts and bolts, had that with us. You also want to prepare your body. And to prepare our bodies, we rode as much as we could. I focused on getting in at least 2 5-hour rides every week for the 3 weeks leading up to it.
So Robert has told you a little bit about his training. Unfortunately, I was not able to do similar training. The beginning of this year, I had surgery at the end of March where they did a total rotator cuff repair and they repaired my bicep. I was immobilized for a while and then I was in rehab all the way through August. I was able to get on the bike indoors, so I was able to do some training. I use a program called Zwift, where I did some training programs and I was able to build my power back up, but I was not able to get my time. I wasn't able to do any lengthy rides. So before we left, I was determined that we would do a ride where I could at least see if I felt like I could ride outdoors, how comfortable I felt, and whether I could ride back-to-back days. So Robert and I packed our bikes with the same load and the same bags that we would use while we were in Scotland. And we took our bikes on the train and went down to Oregon. And we rode from 2 cities in Oregon, 30 miles one way, spent the night, and 30 miles back the next day. And that went really well. I was very surprised. And it turned out that I was able to do the entire Scotland trip. My arm worked great, and I was concerned about another issue, which was my saddle. I'd been having some issues with a saddle, and I discovered a new one that I use now called the Specialized Mimic, which is for women. And I ordered it for my indoor bike. I tested it on Zwift. It worked great. So I ordered one for my outside bike, road bike, and it worked great. So while I wasn't able to do the training that I wanted to do, at least I was able to see that I would have the power for the trip. I could ride with the amount of weight on my bike that I put on it. With all my bags, the 2 back bags, a tail runner, and the front bag, I was carrying around 30 pounds on my bike, and I was able to do that load.
So that's the what, the how, the why, the where. Who? Well, that's Carol and I and our friend Jeff Bauer. Jeff and I have randoneered together for years. He's a super strong rider and just a really good guy. The when? September. We picked that time of year because we wanted it to be fairly cool, not too crowded with tourists. We wanted it cool enough that the midges, which we've been hearing dire stories about, the midges will eat you alive in Scotland. So we wanted to make sure we were at a low midge time. We wanted also to find a time where it was not as rainy. So that's the reason that we chose September for this trip. I think for the most part, it worked out pretty good. We had some great weather days, and some days we didn't have great weather. So there you have it. Next week, we'll start in Edinburgh, and I'll tell you about how we got to Edinburgh and some interesting things that happened there. This was one of the first places where the plan fails to make allowances for everything that can go wrong. I'll see you then.